GGA regards good governance as imperative and urgent for Africa, which is why we seek to establish facts related to governance, good or bad, because they matter and are of value for building societies, nations, and communities whose governments are effective in implementing initiatives for the improvement of people's lives. Because it's the promise offered by the concept of governance that inspires people to believe, but its failures or shortcomings are what lead to frustration, despair, and dissatisfaction. GGA is located across the African continent, and our facts are obtained through on-the-ground involvement by our people in programs, which are a key aspect of our commitment to actually make a difference, and through data and statistics gathered from reputable researchers and organizations around the world. We put these through a process of rigorous and empirical analysis to reveal the facts of the matter, articulated through our publications, comprising together a reliable resource of fact-based findings accessible for use through various platforms by individuals, organizations, or others like-minded in terms of our belief in the value and integrity of facts. Talk to us. Work with us, because GGA has much to offer to those who seek to inspire, drive, and accelerate good governance across the continent. And that's the key to realizing the possibilities we all believe in for Africa. It's a matter of fact.
Today for this geoscience stakeholder session. So EnerGeo Alliance is a global trade alliance, a nonprofit that represents the geoscience industry, the innovators, developers, data companies who are using earth science to meet exploration, production, and sustainability goals around the world. It's a lot of technical terms. Often when I'm out in the public, I say, we're a nonprofit that connects more people and more communities with sustainable, reliable, accessible energy. Our members were listening, literally, listening to to enable exciting development of future energy. But regardless of whatever your preferred source of energy may be, and what we call the energy evolution, it's going to require a whole lot more energy. The population is growing very well. There's still 600 million people right here in this continent who've never had access to electricity, and there's a much larger number who've never had access to reliable energy, and there's even a greater number who are currently cooking over unclean sources. Animal waste, wood, coal, which is a global health problem. And so there's real needs for our members to be able to help communities unlock their own resource potential. So I appreciate you having this session today so you can discuss these challenging issues and opportunities.
Right, Nikki, many thanks. And again, we're so grateful to EnerGeo for your time and effort, to Ross Compton, who's not here, and to Gail Adams, who is taking pics. We just really appreciate the collaboration. Please do read their contributions in the edition on your table. We've listed it under sponsored content, but it's super important. I'll give some context to how this came about as well. So our current edition of AIF, which is live online at africainfact.com, addresses this challenging question of food and water insecurity, which are both in jeopardy, at least partly because of the climate crisis. And we've run these two issues together on energy and climate ahead of upcoming COP28 summit in late November. On the energy front, material progress is not possible without access, as Nikki said, to reliable energy and widespread electrification. Bjorn Lomberg, who I imagine has become a swear word in some quarters, the head of the Copenhagen Consensus Center, went so far at one stage as to say that it would be better to ensure that all African households had access to electricity, even if it were coal-powered, instead of incurring the constant afflictions of indoor air pollution. I think you also mentioned from burning biomass for heating and cooking, and indoor air pollution does remain a significant source of mortality across the continent. So whatever one might think of Blomberg, the point stands. However, the mining and burning of some hydrocarbons such as coal do produce negative externalities. Forgive me, I'm an economist by training, so we think in terms of negative externalities, which is really just the divergence between private returns and social costs. And typically, these social and environmental costs are offloaded onto poor communities who can least afford it, while profits accrue to firms whose shareholders are invariably far removed from the impact. If, for instance, a country produces sufficient coal to fire its power stations, but irrevocably damages its scarce fresh water supply in the process, which end is preferable. These trade-offs do have to be considered if we are to have honest conversations about the future of our one planet. Climate resilience, similarly, will increasingly depend on the preservation of the continent's remaining wilderness landscapes, both terrestrial and ocean. This is especially the case as the conversation heats up, if you'll excuse the pun, about debt for nature swaps and market-adequate carbon pricing. Having carbon sequestration capacity will double as an income generator and a source of fresh water and food. It is therefore critical that policy choices made today do not lock countries into a future that jeopardizes climate resilience or leaves stranded assets scattered across the continent, especially as fossil fuel divestment gains traction, although that does seem to be, it seems to have its ceiling. Countries do need to be nimble, ensuring an energy supply mix that is as clean and reliable as possible. And again, Nikki alluded to that. These are not easy policy challenges to confront. Nonetheless, the cost of renewable energies do seem to be plummeting, although their supply chains are not entirely clean and silver bullet. And the speed at which power can be made available versus the average build cost, say, of coal or nuclear plants is astonishing. Microgrids perhaps also eliminate the need for expensive centralized transmission grids to be established, and this may represent an opportunity for African countries to leapfrog their more industrialized counterparts, depending on who you read. Nonetheless, there are two broad views that remain entrenched in this debate, polar extremes, if you like, which we are really as a think tank trying to avoid. On the one hand, there are lobbyists yelling, drill, baby, drill. And on the other, there are those unequivocally opposed to hydrocarbons of any sort, never the twain shall meet. The problem, of course, is that policies must be developed subject to constraints and with a deep understanding of the trade-offs involved. I did enjoy Darren Asamogu's comment to Greta Thunberg saying, look, it's one thing to raise awareness, it's another thing entirely to have an adult policy conversation about the difficult choices we need to make as a collective society. The problem, as I say, is that we must develop policies that are subject to constraints. And as the editorial to our energy edition indicates, we wanted to avoid falling into the polar extremes of renewables versus fossil fuels and focus instead on a nuanced examination of optimal energy mixes and pathways. So the content in that edition and what we'll discuss today with our panelists is designed to attain that end. So stuck in the middle of this debate, in many respects, is natural gas. Natural gas is a much cleaner form of energy, as you'll know, than its traditional hydrocarbon counterparts. I'm not an expert. I just read the data as an economist, though, of course, not cleaner than nuclear. But nuclear is also heavily opposed by many environmentalists. So we are facing some serious difficulties. In South Africa, the potential presence of natural gas off our coastline has become a source of controversy. This is largely to do with inadequate community consultation that, for instance, saw Shell's exploration activity off the Wild Coast interdicted by the High Court in the Eastern Cape. The result also had the Minister of Minerals and Energy insinuating that South African lobby groups opposed to hydrocarbons were externally funded agents against development. Just for the record, we are not funded by the CIA. We'd have a lot more resources at our disposal. Anyway, this brings us to today's conversation. At Good Governance Africa, we covered the Shell incident, and we're privileged to be contacted by the EnerGeo Alliance, which questioned what we had published regarding the environmental impacts of seismic surveys. Outlined here together with Nikki. So how we're going to run this is I'm going to ask each speaker to contribute 5 to 10 minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll have a moderated conversation, and then we'll open it up to the floor. We have a relatively intimate setting here, so please do feel free to ask the questions, and we'll have the panelists answer them as adequately as possible. To those online, please do ask your questions as well. And those that are legible and short and succinct will be fed through to me, and I'll try and include them just so that you're not excluded online. So I'm going to, for the sake of time, just keep introductions short, but I would like to welcome first Professor Wazi Ngubabana, who is the Director of the African Energy Leadership Centre at the Wits Business School. He is a seasoned chemical engineer, energy executive and academic with extensive global experience in renewable energy, advisory and water desalination industries. Second, we have Professor Ken Findley, who is a specialist consultant and has been instrumental in developing global ocean accounts, partnership with the Africa Community of Practice. Former research chair of Oceans Economy at Cape Peninsula University of Technology in Cape Town, and previously directed the MRI Whale Unit of the University of Pretoria. Last but not least, we have Professor Muniba Isaacs, who is a professor and academic coordinator. She's with the Institute for Property, Land and Agrarian Studies, PLAS, at the University of the Western Cape. And I do want to encourage you to utilize the PLAS website. It's full of fantastic academic work. So, yeah, to our speakers, many thanks. And Razi, if I could kick off with you, sir, that'd be great. So if you could give our speakers a round of hand, that'd be great.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. So, firstly, I haven't prepared a presentation because I'm hoping this becomes a conversation. It's not for me to give a lecture, it's for me to just express my views and then hear from you what your thoughts. So, you touched on a lot of points that I would have, that I want to speak to. But when we speak of the future of energy in Africa, there's just a number of things, but it's a few things I'd like to touch on. Firstly, I think it's very important that when you speak of the future of energy in Africa, that we cannot speak for Africa without it being by Africa and in Africa. I think that's really, really important. And the reason for that is that when Africans are talking about their future, we are able to take into account our unique circumstances. We're able to take into account our own needs. And then, as you've greatly highlighted, energy poverty is rife on the continent. It's not electricity only, it's all energy. And this is a situation that needs to change before we can start discussing what the future looks like. Eradicating energy poverty. Secondly, this needs to be driven, and I think we've already made the mistake as a continent, as a country, and I think as a globe, of having energy policy being driven by ideology. The transitioning policies have not been driven by technology as has happened before. And we really should have let the science do the talking. Let the science prove that, technology X is cleaner, it is cheaper, and so forth, and that it can compete with others. But we've come from an ideology perspective, and I really have a problem with that. Because ideology does not take into account the circumstances of the people, the circumstances of the end users, those who really need the energy. And I think we've made a very, very big mistake there. But I don't think we have reached a point where we can't become more pragmatic in our approach. I think we still have a window to say, region X, these are their needs, this is what resources that they've got available, and this is how region X will transition according to what they can afford, according to what they've got at their disposal. Also, I think speaking of transitioning to a cleaner energy future on the continent, I think one of the big issues for me is the lack of financing for renewable energy on the continent, the cleaner energy on the continent. I think Africa still sits at the very bottom of renewable energy investment, and to me, it just does not compute that we are pushing for Africa to go green, but at the same time we're not putting the money where our mouths are. But also very importantly in that financing equation is African financing. Because it's well and good to go to the rest of the world and be hand in hand begging for finance, but we need to put our own money into it. And secondly, when it comes to the financing, I think one of the things that needs to happen is that Africa needs to start demanding a seat at the table in terms of the terms of this financing. We cannot continue being, as a continent to be exploited. Africa does hold a great deal of the critical minerals that we need to transition to a cleaner future. But it makes no sense to me that we will continue being exploited. We export these raw minerals and then we import technologies, we import skills. So Africa needs to be fully involved in the entire value chain, in my view, as we transition. I just want to move on to maybe two last points in terms of how I see the picture looking in the future. You've already mentioned nuclear in your conversation, and that it is not very popular with a lot of environmentalists. But if we let the science do the talking, it is pretty clear. Yes, nuclear at this point, relative to other technologies, is still a little bit, expensive. That's one conversation. But in terms of its carbon footprint, it's indisputable that nuclear is actually the cleanest. Yes, there are other considerations in terms of the environmental impact, biodiversity, and all sorts of other conversations which you can have. But in terms of the carbon footprint, nuclear is by far the cleanest. And I think nuclear into the future has to form a part of the energy mix. But also when the transition, you mentioned the issue of gas, which is sort of part of the conversation. And again, if we get the science to the top, not the technology, gas needs to form a big part of the distant transition into a lower carbon future. Because if we try and
not only are there issues around supply chains, as you said, but there's also issues around the availability of the actual minerals. So you have to start afresh. You have to do an exploration and whatever for us to get the minerals that we need to look for. It's in the hundreds of to the billions, depending on which minerals. If we're being realistic, it's not going to happen in the next 10 years, in the next 15 years, maybe in the next 10 years. We will not be able to build enough mines to completely jump over the gas. In my opinion, over the gas base. So we should be using gas, which is cleaner than coal, as the backup, to create a more future. So I'll leave it for now. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions.
Terrific. Well, thank you very much. Very thorough opening remarks, and it's some opportunity for questions around that later. I need the point that science should drive the conversation rather than ideology. I wonder also about lobbying efforts that are predicated on science, but essentially are driving firm interests, capital interests. So much food for thought. I'd like to hand over to Professor Ken Finley for his opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me? So I just want to start out by saying that I'm certainly going to come at this from an ocean perspective, because that's where I come from. And what I'm going to try and put across today is the need for seeking an informed balance between the energy security and ocean protection in a model that balances comprehensive ocean wealth. So model that balances comprehensive ocean wealth. So a model that balances ocean wealth with natural capital, sustainability, inclusivity, and ocean health. I'm going to predicate this in terms of people's have a long history of interaction with the ocean. An interaction that I refer to as the human-ocean nexus that centers on two important aspects. One are the direct ocean and / blue economy, the formal and informal resource uses and their associated pressures, the externalities across numerous sectors. The second important interaction is the indirect benefits that humans obtain from the ocean space without any input in terms of factors of production, human or capital, for example. These direct resource uses and pressures require, and I'm going to push this quite hard, adaptive ocean governance embodied in sustainable ocean planning put forward by the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economies, the 17 heads of state across the globe that are pushing for 100% sustainable ocean planning, sustainable ocean development within their exclusive economic zones by 2025. There are important aspects within current ocean governance principles. Historically, and to a large extent still currently, ocean value for trade-off decisions between sectors and between sectors and the environment are often based on the contribution of those sectors to GDP metrics. And while GDP metrics and those contributions are really important in terms of macroeconomic planning, strategic investment, etc., they are not full cost models. There are numerous externalities that need to be taken into consideration. A second aspect of ocean governance that we need to look at quite carefully is the way ocean change is occurring. And ocean change is occurring across three dimensions. Firstly, ocean resource uses are changing. Across the globe, countries are turning to the exclusive economic zones to advance their blue economies. We're seeing it almost entirely coming almost across the globe in terms of the Operation Pakisas, Kenya's Grow Blue, the European Union's Blue Growth, Mozambique's Pro Azul, for example. Secondly, associated with those advancement of blue economies are the increase in ocean pressures associated with those sectors. pollutants, unsustainable extraction, habitat modification, climate change, invasive translocations. I could go on and on. And those are quite critical to be bringing into the model, the way oceans are changing. And the third is the important way, or the important change in the manner in which we do ocean monitoring and science. What we do now in terms of remote sensing, in terms of robotics, in terms of the way we do ocean sciences, compared to what we used to do 15 to 20 years ago, it's completely different. Our access to big data, analytics, etc., opens a whole new realm in terms of informing ocean governance that we need to bring into this situation. What the previous speaker was talking about, it underpinning by science. The third aspect that I need to really put across here is that sustainable ocean planning, whether you call it integrated ocean governance, sustainable ocean planning, inclusive and sustainable blue economies, are underpinned by either independent, overlapping, or nested tripartite economic, social, and environmental sustainability pillars. We see those all the time. And those pillars are not, or the integration of those pillars, the integration of the social, the economic, and the environment are not well defined in the ocean space. And we need to look at new models of comprehensive ocean wealth. And these models require informed and evidence-based adaptive ocean governance that is inclusive, integrative, and iterative in terms of process, area-based, ecosystem-based, and knowledge-based in terms of content, and endorsed, financed, and capacity-enhanced in terms of implementation. And what I'm arguing for is the balance within comprehensive ocean wealth models of the human-produced built capital and non-produced or natural capital components of this ocean space. There are very well-defined externalities of the upstream oil and gas exploration and production sector. Externalities within exploration, seismics, and their associated bathymetric surveys that are often overlooked. Sometimes these bathymetric sonars that are far greater concern to me in terms of acoustic pollution than seismic air guns, for example. There are a suite of these in relation to production. There are externalities in terms of the decommissioning phase. Each of these carry potential sectoral production pressures, production in terms of sectoral pressures to the environment, both in terms of sectoral environmental conflict and sector conflict in terms of exclusion and loss of access of other ocean resource users. I do believe we also need to look at this ocean question in relation to the consumptive pressures, not so much the production pressures of the sector, but the consumptive pressures of the use of those particular products in terms of aspects of climate change and pollution, plastic pollutions, for example. I also think it's absolutely imperative to acknowledge or to look at the fluid and boundary porous nature of the ocean space. Nothing that occurs here stays here in terms of ocean currents, in terms of three-dimensionality of the ocean space. It is a far more difficult space to manage than a terrestrial space, where these flows are not as extensive, not as large. I could go into a number of different pressures of particular sectors. I have worked extensively within the seismic acoustic pollution arena. Very often the mitigation that is utilized within the geophysical survey industry really relates to, centered on marine mammals, centered on things that we can see, things that can move, mitigation in terms of soft starts and avoidance aspects. I, as a marine scientist, am way more concerned with the impacts of things we cannot see, things that cannot move. We work on a very linear model in terms of the way sound attenuates within the water space. If we look at some of the acoustic models that are out there, we can see similar received acoustic levels at 12 kilometers at depth that we'd see at 2 kilometers at the surface. So we really need to relook at some of the ways that we are managing and mitigating the externalities of some of these sectoral pressures. It does amaze me, for example, that the entire industry here in South Africa in terms of acoustic pollution is managed through environmental management plans, environmental impact assessments. And there's nothing within the marine or maritime legislation that talks about acoustic pollution. I'm restricted as a member of the public from approaching a whale closer than 300 meters. There's nothing in the legislation that talks to the way I can introduce very large acoustic signals into the ocean space. So a lot of what I'm talking about really talks to conflict between sectors and the environment, but there are conflicts between sectors and sectors which need to be considered here as well in terms of inclusivity, in terms of loss of access. Not only loss of access at the time, but loss of access as well to particular ecosystem services produced by the environment that might have been compromised by particular activities. So one more slide, if I may, or a couple more things. Let's get there. So what I want to really put across is that we hear, or I was in a roundtable meeting within the South African International Maritime Institute 2 weeks ago, and we heard a lot about the opportunities for increased energy security, contribution to GDP, improved balance of payments, increased foreign direct investments, gross fixed capital formation, employment opportunities, additional and associated generation of tax revenues. But what I'm going to argue here for is the need for a full cost model that includes the externalities. If we're going to reap the benefits of this particular offshore oil and gas industry, we must please look at the costs thereof as well. Current environmental impact assessments and environmental management plans draw information from the global literature. Some of this information is relatively dated. There's also absolutely or very little local information. We have no science, local science, actually to underpin some of these externalities we're talking about. So I'm going to argue that there's a dire need for a locally contextualized information and knowledge program across social, economic, and environmental realms to inform adaptive policy cycles in a science to evidence-based governance process to resolve the sector-to-sector and sector-to-environment conflicts, management, and the associated trade-offs that we need to undertake in order to advance the oil and gas sector. And I really feel that there's a need for a comprehensive research program across, as I say, social and environmental and economic components, so that we can come at this with a really informed kind of knowledge base, rather than some of the relatively speculative arguments that we hear at the moment. I think we've got an incredibly biodiverse, incredible natural capital in the ocean, South African ocean space. And we just need to be aware of those trade-offs. Thank you, Chair.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, Professor Harvey. I'd like to hand over to Professor Isaacs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also thank you very much for the invitation to speak on a platform with people that I'm not really familiar speaking to. So bear with me. I'm going to focus my input particularly on small-scale fishes, local communities in and around the ocean related to the seismic surveys. So part of it, I'm also going to try and tell you a story and take you a little bit back. So Ross mentioned the seismic surveys that was conducted by Shell on the Wild Coast, and also by Searcher on the West Coast is another seismic surveys. So and small-scale fishes challenged big oil companies. But I want to tell you that small-scale fishes are not new to challenging in court cases in post-democracy in South Africa. One of the kind of leading case that South Africa small-scale fisheries had is the one of Kenneth George and others against the Minister of Environmental Affairs and Tourism back in 2005. And the small-scale fishers basically approach this form of showing their discontent with the processes in the Equality Court and also in the High Court. And the Equality Court was basically framed in their fundamental rights. So when we talking about energy, when we're talking about gas, when we're talking about blue economy and the benefits and the wealth and the natural capital, we need to talk about what are the fundamental rights of local communities, coastal communities, fishers that are engaging in the same space and had been many generations and centuries tracing back to First Nations in South Africa. So the fundamental rights of equality and dignity is framed in our Bill of Rights. And small-scale fishers have used this very creatively to kind of frame this in part of not only just their environmental rights, but also their right to food, right to livelihood, right to custom, right to culture. So when we talk about energy and when we talk about blue economy and the benefits of it and the wealth and all of that, fundamental human rights and fundamental environmental rights is very important. And I have seen the debate fast-tracking around the blue economy and energy seems to be at two levels. One, the potential wealth that you can create out of this, so it's profit-based. And on the other is how to protect the environment. And if we add a little bit of, livelihoods and inclusivity and social and economics or socio-economics that is often used to kind of be inclusive of communities is often problematic. So I think that communities and local communities actually needs a seat at the table where decisions are made, not only about policy, but also about finances. So financing, what are you financing, how you're financing is very important. So another example around the Shell was first just looking at the environmental rights of the oceans was not successful in terms of the court interdict. So alliance between environmental NGOs and small-scale fishers was what was given what the judge flipped on in terms of no matter how much millions you have spent, it is important to protect those fundamental rights of people who source a livelihood, who is part of their culture, their custom, spirituality and well-being of the communities. And this was also a success in the interdict of the Searcher case on the West Coast, when communities were very familiar with what are our rights, how to defend our rights, and how to form alliances with other environmental groups. But I also want to say that sometimes communities are used for a particular purpose, and once we get the interdict, we move to another environmental issues. And that I find highly problematic, is that almost that it is Once fishers are now saying to environmental groups, these are our socio-economic issues and our problems. Many were saying, but we never really signed up for this. We only wanted that court interdict. So I think it is important in terms of alliances and the fact that communities are often used as tokens to kind of get to a particular point. And I think that is very important. But I also worry that court cases is not necessarily the solution. Not everything, things are not changed by a court interdict. And things are not going to change when it comes to seismic surveys for small-scale fishers and their livelihoods. It's not going to change that. Things need to be done differently, and that's where the financial and financialization of communities. And I think that it is important when we look at blue finance. The marginal groups are often women, and local people are not part of the thinking when we think of blue financing. A key part of governance that Professor Finlay mentioned is that you need to kind of be consultative of different stakeholders. But the arrogance of many consultancies is that we only consult with people who are good on the ear and good on the eye for us to be to consult with. But when it's not necessarily that, we don't really extend ourselves. We didn't even think that small-scale fishers is an entity or a group that is an important group. And I have to tell you, my talk thus far is only focused on local. But in Africa, there are 200 million people who are sourcing livelihoods, small-scale fishing around the coast, both coastal and inland. We have a coastal space of 38,000 kilometers around the coast. But we're introducing aquaculture that has been a failure in many countries, and one of two countries, maybe Nigeria and Egypt, because of catfish, had been successful. So it's also the nature and the type of projects, and I agree with the first speaker that the consultation is not with local communities as to find from them what are the solutions. I think we speak a lot about science and scientific knowledge, but when we speak about local knowledge and indigenous knowledge, it's often overlooked. And I think that it is important that knowledge systems need to be included in the decision making. And it is because of one of the kind of tipping point in one of the cases, in the Searcher case, was the fact that local people were saying, this is our livelihood, the species called snook. Maybe you have tasted it. Maybe you don't like it. Maybe you think that you will lose your teeth if you eat it. But I promise you, it is extremely high in protein. It has omega-3 and 6. It is affordable. And because of the cultural and the importance in nutrition, this was also a tipping point for the decision of the judge to grant this interdict against Searcher. I want to come back that interdicts is just for what it is. But there are other companies that are exploring. And to what extent are these communities going to become more overlooked, more invisible, if we are not going to make it inclusive? We can't just say inclusive as part of a language that looks good on policy. We actually need to say, how are we going to include communities and local people in the decision making, but more so, let's not only talk about policy, because people will say, I don't eat policy. Let's talk about financialization and extend this to making them as part of the decision making. Thank you very much.
Terrific. We've got a lively conversation on our hands. So to all of our panelists, thank you very, very much. It's terrific to have you all. Yeah. Yeah, Prof. Rawazi, if I could start with you, sir. You made this important point about ideology versus science, and just given what Prof. Isaacs has said. I wonder if you could just maybe expand on that point a little bit. I also wanted to ask you a question about the trade-offs between nuclear and new forms of energy, which could potentially get going much faster, but perhaps aren't as reliable. But maybe let's kick off with the ideology versus science and how you see that playing out, not only here, but across the continent.
Yeah. So the two extremes that we've spoken about already, the one being drill, baby drill, almost no care for the consequences, almost no care for the externalities. And there is the other extreme that speaks to nothing if it's not renewable, nothing if it's not solar or wind. But that conversation, I'll start with the solar and wind. If we're being honest, when we talk about the costs and whatever, we say those technologies are the cheapest and whatever, I would actually like to see somebody show me the numbers where solar and wind plus the battery plus the grid costs, and then to add to that, you add the externalities, because those things don't come out of nowhere. You've got to mine them somewhere. What about the impact of the mining of this? We tend to forget that conversation because we're focusing on ideology, that it's got to be solar and or wind. And the numbers look good if we do a levelized cost of energy, but when you do a full cost of the system, it looks very different. It looks very, very different. So this is what I'm talking about when I say it's ideology driven. And of course, like I said, on the other extreme, that is, we need oil and gas, and it's got, as Prof was saying, the amazing benefits. And again, we don't take into account what Prof was talking about here, the communities. We don't consult. We don't do the full externalities when we have these conversations. And so that's where I come from when I say we are being driven by ideology, instead of saying, what are the numbers telling us? What is the science telling us? Is nuclear, if we do a full life cycle assessment on carbon, is it good for the environment? If we do a full life cycle assessment on wind, is it better than nuclear or whatever? And we need to let the numbers take us there. We need to look at the cost. The cost is not just the cost of building a power station, whatever. It's the cost to the consumer at the end. I mean, you look, for example, at numbers. If you look at penetration of clean energy in Europe, being a typical example, the numbers are clear. They speak for themselves. The higher your penetration of renewables, the higher the cost to the end user. Now, we need to ask ourselves, as communities on this continent, are we at that point where we can afford, literally afford to switch on the lights? Wonderful, we want to have clean air, and I think that's fantastic, and we need to. But we need to think pragmatically about how we get there. Can our people actually afford, at this point in time, to switch on the lights if we say, let's jump all the way to zero
emissions, at least during the operation of that plant. So this is what I'm saying. We need to really be sensible. We need to let the science, we need to let the numbers do the talking, and we need to let our people decide. Because even with renewable energy, there's a lot to be considered. Let's think about it. The amount of land you need for solar, the amount of land you need for wind. What impact does that have on those communities where these plants are located and need to be located? What is the involvement of those communities in the decision making as to whether to locate a plant here or not? And of course, it goes with all technologies, right? And again, when we do the mining for these minerals, what's the impact? What do those communities have to say where these minerals are located? What are they getting out of this conversation? Is there actual benefits to the community, and not just financial benefits? Prof spoke about indigenous knowledge systems. She spoke about protection of cultural rights and so forth. And we need to have honest and open conversations with all of the different technologies, all the different energy carriers. We need to consider all of those things and not be driven by, we want nothing but. So that's where I come from.
Terrific. I think that's very well said. The big question from a governance perspective is, I imagine, arriving at a common framework where those with different interests may see things differently because of where they sit, and the numbers presented may not necessarily be compelling to the trade-offs that they themselves have to incur. I remember Danny Roddick's point that globalization has diffuse gains but acute losses, and that creates social political problems. And then we have Trump, for instance, birthed out of some of those losses. So how do we move, and this is a question to all the panelists, how do we move to a kind of framework where we can have these conversations about trade-offs, externalities, what is actually best for our local community, and at the same time, how do we communicate these complex dynamics to local communities? Because it is really tough. If you're not a fishing community and you stand to benefit from a solar plant, for instance, then you may have no regard for where the cobalt comes from or where the lithium comes from for batteries, etc. You may have no regard for where the Chinese labor is used in the construction of those panels. So how do we move from this kind of a conversation to one in which there's some level of agreement in the first instance on what a full cost model might look like? Prof. Razi, I'll come back to you, but Prof. Ken, I wonder if you could just maybe talk more about what a full cost model looks like and how it might translate into how we communicate.
So one of the difficulties of presenting off cuff rather than showing you a PowerPoint presentation is that it's difficult for me to put across some of these models that we've been developing. I come from a marine mammal background. I spent 35 years in a very exciting space. And I started looking towards moving into a very much more human ocean nexus space. That materialized from an oil and gas project I was involved in central Mozambique, where involved in the environmental management planning of that, the entire program and the particular proponent walked away from the acreage eventually, was show-stopped by the presence of a highly or critically endangered species, dugongs, within the area. I became at that time coming at this from a marine mammal science perspective, increasingly aware of the need to look at the big picture. Until we looked at what were the particular pressures, what were the impacts, what were the across social, economic realms, environmental realms, etc., but from commercial to small scale, from formal to informal economies, and through that started looking towards something called ocean accounting. Now, When I start talking ocean accounting, I see people's eyes glaze over, and then he's going to get on the economic road. It's going to be. Ocean accounting is a really exciting, novel ocean discipline, ocean governance tool that allows us to utilize the information that is often readily available in things like national statistical offices, system of national accounts, the United Nations system of environmental economic accounts, the central framework. And it's a process that allows us to integrate flows between particular environments to the economies, from economies to the people, the risks of those flows. And to me, and having worked in this space for the last 4 years, it is one of the first ways that we can start looking towards full cost models, because we can integrate flows of natural capital between ecosystem or abiotic services to economies. We can get hard metrics on those particular flows. We can get flows of the impacts, the pressures of those sectors back to ecosystem extents, ecosystem conditions, and the impacts on ecosystem services. So we're starting to look towards using ocean accounts for an integrated framework that talks to marine spatial planning, that talks to integrated ocean governance, that talks to integrated coastal zone management, in order to underpin the questions with some hard data. We can't measure everything. Anybody who tells me that the value of the ocean is X, Y, or Z, I will say nonsense. There are so many things you can't measure. It's actually an exercise in measuring the infinite. But there are some things that we can measure consistently. And if we can make consistent, regular measurements, we can provide ourselves with indicators, benchmarked indicators of how an employment sector is increasing or decreasing, how a fishery is increasing or decreasing, how natural capital is increasing or decreasing. And I wanted to say that I think there's some very exciting novel approaches to that overarching framework for full cost accounting. And can I just comment on a couple of things as well?
And then I'm going to open it up to the floor. I have plenty of questions for our panelists.
And so they're just comments in relation to particularly Prof. Isaacs talked about what we call milk, okay? And that's the marine and maritime indigenous and local knowledge that is absolutely critical. So when I talk about science, I'm talking about comprehensive science. I'm not talking about only a kind of a Western orientated science model. It's critical. The other aspect of that is, if I look at the work that we do in Kenya, in Mozambique, in Madagascar, we're still shuffling some numbers, but the importance of the informal and subsistence economies is huge. The issue with that is that informal and subsistence economies are not reflected in national accounts. National accounts in terms of GDP talk to, are measured in terms of tax revenues, in terms of the way finances are banked, etc. And there's an entire missing component in terms of informal economies that we are concentrating in the Western Indian Ocean, and how to get a measure of those. Because until we have a measure, it's very difficult to manage in terms of the numbers that governments are requesting. And then finally, I want to just talk about the ocean. And we've heard a lot about solar, we've heard a lot about wind. One of the aspects that we deal with in the South African ocean economy is what we call a high energy coastline. We are limited in terms of particular oil and gas opportunities by a Dallas current that runs at 2 meters a second in 8 meter swells. It's a very high energy area. And I've always wondered, where is ocean energy in this, in terms of physical ocean energy? And where is ocean energy in this mix in terms of OTEC? And that's ocean thermal energy conversion. We deal here in the Benguela with an upwelling system that produces a remarkable thermocline, very cold waters close to the coast with high air temperatures. The flux, or the difference between those, are huge in terms of potential for ocean thermal energy conversion. I think we do need to start looking at other technologies over and above just wind and solar. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a question of Prof. Isaacs before we open up to the floor. Prof, I wonder if you could just elaborate on what genuine, meaningful consultation with communities actually looks like. And so how do we move beyond using the word inclusivity as a token rather than as something genuinely, authentically practiced? And from a governance perspective, how do we avoid communities simply being used as pawns in other people's games?
I think that your question is a very good question, and it's not an easy answer. When you step in communities, you also step into local politics. So as what you find in many other spaces, there's a lot of elite capture. There's a lot of people who are fronting and talking on behalf of communities. I think that we're not investing enough in the research of understanding how to work with communities. So my work has always been action research in nature. So I work with the communities and we work alongside, and they frame what are the key issues. So my concept development and my ideology comes from the communities as to what are the issues and what are the struggles. So there are lots of inequality. There's a lot of social issues that one of the first responses I often get is that it's not the responsibility of the fisheries department to sort out the social problems. Or it's not the responsibility from conservation or parks or marine protected areas to sort out the social problems. And then you will find, on the other hand, government would say, we just don't have enough money. So whose responsibility is and where do we start? So somehow we need to get into the complexity. We need to get into the messiness. We need to get into the politics. And I'm not talking party politics. I'm talking about who benefits. And from the beginning, you need to target the most marginalized. And those are often women and youth, and you work your way through the communities. Action research takes a long time to be successful. So you cannot frame a project in 2 years' time and think that you will have an outcome. Or you think that your project that you have, that an added part is social science, and you get a social scientist like myself who's been invited to kind of sort out all the social issues and the problems. And I think that is not how you frame. That needs to be part of the process. So for me, it is about process methodology. It is about working with and alongside, and also stepping out of your comfortability and being uncomfortable, being asked the challenges and the questions. And I think that one of the fishermen is sitting here, and he knows that fishermen will take you to the uncomfortabilities. And I think it is a process. It's a long-term process. I think it is an investment. And we are focusing a lot on science and technology, but very little on how to work with communities and making them part of the process. And it's not going to be automatic, because some of these spaces are incredibly uncomfortable, and these spaces are not a space where you can just automatically say that they can have a seat at the table. But I would like whoever is part of this discussion to be part of the journey and the process of getting there, and look at meaningful participation and inclusivity in a way that makes change.
Terrific. Yeah, from a governance perspective, it sounds like we certainly have our work cut out for us. And as economists, speaking on behalf of my profession, if you like, the proclivity is to place misguided or undue faith in technology sometimes as some kind of silver bullet. But technology doesn't solve complex social issues. It doesn't necessarily solve the difficult trade-offs, etc. So on that note, I'd like to open up to the floor and just take some questions for our panelists. Prof. Razi, I'm going to come back to you on the nuclear question because it's still burning me. All right. Yeah, friends, colleagues, please do just raise your hand and we'll have somebody bring you a mic. Right. Mahmoud.
Thank you. Thank you for such a wonderful panel there. You give us a lot of information, which took a while to process. But it's pretty clear that there's quite a good amount of regarding the social inclusion and participation, which is critical in every way, in every society. And I'm grateful for that input. But the one area that I have a little bit of and in this case, Professor, maybe you can enlighten us a little bit more. You mentioned the issues regarding sound and how that could affect the mammals at sea. From my understanding, this particular industry that we were talking about, seismic here, has been around for over 100 years. And I'm sure there's been studies along the way and a lot of observations made. Can you point to us any particular research that you know of that could actually give us a very good understanding of the potential damage, if there is one, and how that came about and what the outcome was? And just to give us, enlighten us on that, if you could, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. There is a fair volume of literature out there on the impacts and the potential impacts of acoustics or seismic acoustic introduction into the ocean space. What I'm putting across is that it's very often centered around marine mammals. Very often we hear that the issue in the environmental space is marine mammal hearing, for example. And what I'm saying is that very often the industry mitigates that through marine mammal observers, be they passive acoustic monitoring or visual observations, etc. There are a suite of, or there's a suite of information relating to particular faunal groups that cannot move, that are restricted in movement, avoidance of particular acoustic impulses. The work done by Robert Macaulay's group in Western Australia on the impacts of seismics on plankton, for example. 10, 12, 15 years ago, we were of the understanding that the impacts on plankton were relatively minor, in the order of meters. Work carried out and published in, I think, in Nature and Sustainability, actually, talks to extensive impacts at plankton levels in terms of seismic surveys. There are impacts in terms of, and this is what I was referring to in terms of sonars. I'm more concerned with the impacts of the associated bathymetric sonars in terms of the volume of acoustic energy that is placed into the ocean space. A seismic is a blast of, let's say, up to 200, and let's say around about 250 decibels at 1 micropascal at 1 meter, introduced into the ocean space every 8 to 15 seconds in terms of a survey. And so the total, it wasn't a seismic, it was seismic. So the total volume of energy is impulsive. It's bang, nothing, bang, nothing, bang, nothing. If one introduces high intensity sonars that are used in the associated bathymetric surveys, which go off in milliseconds at high levels, they're much higher energy introduced to the ocean space. And we have very, very, very clear evidence, including from the seismic industry, of marine mammal mortalities from sonars as opposed to air guns. Yet sonars are almost totally ignored in impact assessment studies.
There's a mic that shouldn't be on. Oh, goodness.
So
Sorry about that.
So I do think there are certain very clear examples in relating to juvenile turtles, in relating to plankton, in relating to fish, that may be at various levels. And I think it's important. One of the slides I would have shown if I'd shown a PowerPoint is something called PCAD, and that's the population consequences of acoustic disturbance, where a particular frequency or particular intensity might change a behavior, which might change a particular energy uptake, which might change fitness, which might change a breeding cycle, which might change a reproductive rate right through the population. Sure. So I think what I'm looking at here, what concerns me is here in South Africa, we draw on what has been published in literature elsewhere. And there's high time we need local research on snook, on southern right whales, on our local fauna, our local communities, and our local economies in order to have really local information to address some of these questions. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Actually, answered parts of my question. Given what you just said, and the fact that there's been quite a lot of this across, say, US, Europe, continents, what restrictions have they put in place to avoid these issues you're referring to? And I appreciate the fact that needs to be a local research done. But of course, other research can also assist and can be a precursor for something else that can happen here. So what restrictions have been put in place on the other parts of the world regarding seismic as opposed to here, for instance?
So I think what we have in place here in terms of environmental management plans, in terms of the environmental impact assessments, is based on best available practice, best available information, whether it's through JNCC, whether it's through guidelines from the US, guidelines from Australia, etc. I think we follow global best practice in terms of those sort of mitigation and management protocols required. However, those are not contextualized for a South African situation. I think it's really important that we have the information from local environments in order to manage these processes. And so the other thing I think is important here is that we often draw on quite dated information for some of the planning that we do. And that concerns me, because I think there's quite a dire need to for management plans for particular components of the sector to be updated. My understanding, and I might be incorrect here, is one of the issues within the court case in the Eastern Cape and Shell related to the fact that the environmental management plans have been produced some 3 years or more before, when the acreage was granted. It was not an updated process just prior to that particular survey. And so I think there's a need for so what I'm going to refer to here is there's a need for an adaptive process. There's a need to incorporate change, to incorporate the best available, be it on the social side of the issue. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks. Thanks, Mark. Sorry, guys, if I could ask you please to just introduce yourself, name and designation, that'd be very helpful. Okay, other hands. I might suggest taking the specifics of the seismic impact question offline, but yeah, thanks. Stephen, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the panelists. Very insightful presentations. My question is global also be able to shed some insight. Sorry, I'm Stephen from Good Governance Africa. I was reading a study released yesterday by the International Labour Organization and International Energy Research Agency, which indicated that as of 2023, 320,000 Africans are employed within renewable energy sector. Their first study was 2018, and given population growth, that's actually a 0.6% decline in terms of Africans employed within the sector. I just wanted to get your thoughts on how you locate job creation within the energy transition debate, particularly given that I think, in my opinion, the greatest threat to political stability on the continent is the fact that our economies aren't growing fast enough to absorb a growing labor force. And with energy sources like wind and solar, it seems to me at least that they're mostly imported technologies that aren't produced locally, and once they're established, they don't need a lot of local labor to upkeep. So just your opinions around that and how we think about that.
Yeah, I think that's a very controversial conversation in some quarters, because you're talking about 320,000 within the renewable energy sector. Some people will say, that's more than the coal sector, for example, currently employs. But as you pointed out, in terms of the growing population of the continent, that's nothing, right? So where do you locate jobs as we transition? So I made the point earlier that Africa, if we are to, well, not if we are, while we are transitioning, Africa needs to be involved in the full value chain. That's what the jobs are. The jobs are in the generation of IP, so new research ideas. We need to invest in research on the continent, on the different technologies and future technologies that we may not have discovered at this point. As long as our R&D investment is pitiful, we are not going to be able to participate in the value chain. So that's where jobs begin. Jobs are obviously in the mining sector, because again, we will need all this critical mineral, right? But we shouldn't mine and export. We need to value add on the continent. So we need to build our manufacturing capability on the continent. So exporting lithium, you can't export. We shouldn't be exporting raw lithium as a continent. We should be making batteries. Now, that's going to take a lot of planning and I think integration within the continent, because DRC might have or Zimbabwe might have the lithium, but they might not have the manufacturing capacity within Zimbabwe. South Africa might have some of that. And another country, Angola, might have a different mineral. So how do we plan as a region? How do we plan as a continent to say, on batteries, these are the components that we need. Where are the flows, to make this specific batteries? Just as an example, if the South African chemicals industry is, able to produce the plastics and whatever else that we need, how do we connect the value chains throughout the continent, and make sure that what eventually comes out of this continent is the final product? That's where we're going to create the jobs in the full value chain. As long as we said we're importing technologies, then we're going to be losers. As long as we're importing the skills, as long as we're importing the financing, we're going to be losers in this picture. So we need to be very clear on our industrialization as a region, as a continent, and that's the only way, and full participation in the energy value chain. For me, that's the only way we're going to not only save current jobs, but we'll be able to create future jobs. You know, whether it's in the AI space or, you know, whatever, on how to control grids and mini grids and so forth, all the new upcoming technologies, how to trade energy on blockchain and all of that. If we are importing all of that, we're going to be losers. So we need to fully participate in the value chain.
Great. I don't have any further answers, Stephen, because that's a difficult question. Yeah, Prof, please go ahead.
I want to challenge that we're talking about jobless growth on the continent. We're talking about technology, and we're talking about a high percentage of unskilled labor. That is maybe now in the coal sector. And if I think of all the value added and people who are working in the coal sector in terms of unskilled labor, and I think of them transitioning to renewables, I don't see that happening. And for me, it's also about the skills, the capacity of those transition. And that's why more and more we're talking about the just transition in the energy sector. And I deeply worry about adding more unemployment to communities that had been in a coal sector that we all know is not good for the health, but they have to make the choice between having a job or income compared to health. They will take the job. So I think we also need to factor in the realities in terms of where we pitch it and where the jobs are. Because for me, for the last 30 years, there had not been a lot of jobs in unskilled labor. And that is where our population in South Africa is.
Well said.
Working.
Yep.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Pedro Garcia. I'm chairperson of the South African Fishing Plant. We work with small scale fishes, and that's the cap I'd like to wear this morning. So before I pour my heart out, I just want to direct a question or a suggestion towards Ken. You spoke about the sonar issues and not having a lot of data on that. At the moment, there is snook on the West Coast. All right? So I'm just saying, I'm telling you this because it's an opportunity to actually investigate. So what has been happening over the past couple of days is that the minute there's snook detected by the smaller vessels who don't have sonar, all the bigger vessels rush to a particular area, St. Helena Bay for argument's sake. You know, our lionfish sector is highly mobile. So the guys can move from Cape Town, even the Northern Cape, and go to the areas where the fish or the traditional fishing grounds. But what has been happening over the past 2 years is that as soon as those bigger boats, like the 8-10-man boats, come into the areas and they use the sonar is much more detailed and much more accurate for them to determine where the snook is. But it also appears that the sonar is scaring the bigger schools away, leaving the locals without any source of income, because the minute the bigger vessels get onto the grounds, the snook disappear. And then the vessels go back to wherever they come from. And then the smaller vessels in the community, the 1, 2, 3-man buckies, all right, will go out the next day or 2 days after that, and then they find the snook again. So clearly there's a pattern unfolding. And it was interesting to hear that you're talking about sonar not really being investigated and thoroughly interrogated in terms of the potential damage it has on the marine environment. So just that, you know, I thought I'd start with that. Okay, so let me get to the actual point of the discussion. One of the biggest problems
and even here on this platform it persists, is that you talk about us and not to us. That's a huge problem. All right. People don't want to get involved after the fact. People want to get involved when you start something. All right. You should have had community leaders sitting here with you as well to help you determine what the way forward is going to be. Consultation shouldn't be based on what we think our people want. Consultation must be based on what our people want. And the only way to do that, or to get to the core of that, is to have people present. And there's many of the issues that can be resolved. But the minute that you decide that you're going to talk about it first and then approach the communities, in many of our communities, whether it is in the Eastern Cape or whether it's on the West Coast, it is a sign of disrespect. And this is how our people are feeling at the moment. They feel not only are they marginalized, but they are being disrespected. So we need to go out there and speak to our communities, all right? And if we have to go and apologize, then we have to do that and say, listen, we made a mistake, but we are ready to talk about meaningful consultation, not the type of consultation that is projected all over in these conferences and places that we have, because it certainly isn't working. And we're repeating it over. This is very frustrating for me because I'm seeing it year after year. Wherever we go, when we go to conferences of this nature or to roundtables of this nature, this is what we are seeing all the time. And everybody is saying, we must do it right. We must do it right. And to come next year, we must do it right. We must do it right. Come on, guys. You know, when are we going to get to the point where we are serious about what we're doing? Are you going to wait for another Shell interdict that costs you billions, if not millions, if not billions? Are you going to wait until our people die of hunger or starvation? All right. I mean, if you are serious about it, then you need to be serious and include people into these processes, right at the initiation process, not when it suits you or when it suits me. Okay. So also when one look at the just transition in terms of energy, the just transition means different things to different people. People are impacted differently, whether that is by socioeconomics or by politics or their own history. So they view a just transition differently to what you or I may. These are the type of open-ended or open conversations we should be having. There isn't just one just transition. What is a just transition? Is it a methodology? Is it a policy? What is it? Is it a law? We don't know. Our communities don't know. We need to know what we are talking about. How does it impact on our communities? And what do our communities feel in their view is a just transition? So I'm not going to labor this. All I'm about to do was just to get that off my chest and to let you know that I am frustrated. All right, we can't do this year in, year out, and then because next year I'm not going to be frustrated. Next year I'm going to come in with the Marines, and then we need to sort this out. Thank you.
Good points. Well taken. You know, and in a sense, it's a sorry about that. Yeah, in a sense, it's a pipe, and I mean, just to alert you, we did conduct field research down in the Eastern Cape and produced a policy briefing and a full research report out of that, just communicating views from the ground, as it were. So for us at GGA, anyway, it's a pipe, and you know, these are opportunities to converse, and then we create other opportunities as well. My point fully heeded that you know, we'd love to have. I mean, I hate this phrase, community members, because it's a bit nebulous. So, but people who do actually have a stake in the decisions that affect them. So, yeah, points well taken, fully understood and heard. Are there any other questions from the floor? Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Hello.
Yep. Problem with line of sight. No, please fire away.
Hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me well. Okay, my name is Jasper Machugu from Kenya. I'm a farmer, small scale farmer actually. And I have one remark in regards to the just transition theme. So I strongly feel that the West is pushing this like rules and policies onto us, which is not a good thing, because when they say just transition, they don't want us to use our own fossil fuels. They want us to use solar and wind, which is just electricity. And as you all know, electricity is just a tiny percent of the total energy consumption throughout the world, about 20%. And even in Kenya, about 85% of the population have access to electricity. But at the end of the day, you realize that they don't use as much electricity. For instance, my family, we are a family of 6 people. We use 12 to 16 kilowatt hours per month. That's so little compared to what an American refrigerator uses per month. And it doesn't make sense. So the people preaching solar and wind to us didn't use solar and wind to develop. They used fossil fuels. And when they say just transition, they're saying, oh, Africa should not use its fossil fuels. Leave oil and gas on the ground. If we do that, there is no way we're going to power our farm machinery. We can't do irrigation. We can't produce fertilizer. And of course, most importantly, the 4 pillars of modern civilization, which are all available because of fossil fuels: cement, plastic, steel, and fertilizer. There is no way Africa is not going to develop minus fossil fuels. So we shouldn't be embracing or entertaining the just transition theme. That's just people who want to control our resources and our development. They're trying to curtail our development. Thank you.
John, interesting question. I'm going to take one more question from the floor, and then I'm going to ask questions to move to closing remarks, but I'm going to put another question into the mix after this one that perhaps can just guide us home.
Thank you very much. Anja Bradford from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation Energy Security and Climate Change Program. Being a European, I would, appreciate to probably take a bit more of a nuance view on that. I totally understand your anger, if you want to say. I think especially since last year, also Europe is a big step further in saying we need to be more pragmatic. We need definitely to speak about transition fuels and, looking at the diversification of energy mix. But I think we are not getting further if we just have a black and white picture here saying, this is our view, you need to do this. We need to find somewhere in the middle. There need to be a common ground. And as I said, I think we all need to be a bit more pragmatic when it comes to diversification of energy. That was not my my initial statement. I just wanted to not really question, but comment on this issue of and how far can labor, I'm exaggerating now, and how far can the unskilled coal worker become an engineer for hydrogen? We have done a small study, which I would say is really not scientific, in Senegal and Ghana, exactly on the question of the potential of renewable, decentralized job opportunities in the renewable sector. And one argument that I'm missing a bit in the conversation around R&D is the argument of political will. Because when we finish the study, everything that we're saying, this is the potential of jobs that could be created, it all depends on the potential will. Are the national obligations that governments have taken also in Africa on the quote of renewable energy and the energy mix and all, are they going to be fulfilled or not? Because countries are committing to something. And, Europe is not an exception, but then I can make a scenario. But then if my government doesn't hold up to the commitments it has taken, the whole business as usual scenario doesn't stand. So I think we also have to really look into this. It's not only our research and development, skills versus unskilled, and how far does the government commit to implement what it has promised. And that obviously does make a big difference also on the job opportunities in the renewable energy sector. Thank you.
wanting to bring things to a close just because I'd like to create opportunity for networking as well. But it is a critical conversation. So please go ahead.
Thank you for this opportunity. I am Steven from business. So I really loved this conversation that we had around exploration of alternative energy solutions. Okay. More particularly around the cost for the investment conversation that we then put on play. Okay. We are not fully aware of how much is spent and what are the financial, social, and economic implications of such investment. But I think beyond that, there is also something that we do not discuss enough. She mentioned something around government willingness. Okay. I mean, I have been fortunate to travel a lot of African countries, okay, and I have seen and learned that some of these electricity organizations, okay, or entities, okay, are owned by Western organizations or corporations. Do you really think that they will be eager to liberalize, okay, the electricity sector in those countries, meaning that they will put the interest of that nation in order of their financial needs? It's just their comment.
That's correct. Yeah. Well, so I mean, I think in light of the conversation, of the questions that have been asked, and coming back to Anya's point as well, panelists, as we close, one of the burning questions around political will is a very overarching one, and that is how to prevent and reverse the resource curse that does afflict the continent. So whether it's renewables, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's nuclear, just your closing remarks on an optimal way forward. You know, how do we actually come to a point where we can establish an optimal energy pathway that doesn't produce jobless growth and doesn't kill our health and our environment, and how do we actually try and get governments to commit to what is optimal, given that the short-term incentives in our political landscape often lead to unjust decisions. And on this question of a just energy transition, I was at a dialogue with mining industry stakeholders, and one of the comments was, well, transition suggests that you're going from something to something else. Whereas we're in a situation where we're kind of going from nothing to something, 600 million people without access to reliable electricity. So you'll have noted that I can use the phrase just energy transition, partly because it's loaded and partly because it's just it's become a little bit of a difficult term. But yeah, if we can start with Prof. India and finish with Isaacs, that would be great. Thank you, panelists.
Thanks, Chair. I would like to comment on, I think it's Anya's political will question. And this to me talks to the creation of enabling environments for, I'm loath to call them transitions, but for expansion, because I think it pretty much is an expansion question. And I think part of that goes to the way we look at scale. I think for far too often we look at this as we look at energy as it's almost at a corporate scale. It's almost at a big business scale. I think there's huge opportunity to break that scale down into community development of energy, for example. I think it's one of the things we desperately need to look at is how to look at that at a completely different scale. I have had recently had some discussions with a colleague in terms of plastics pyrolysis and the opportunities for small shipping container size pyrolysis opportunities that could be put in communities to convert plastic pollution basically to diesel with a very high conversion ratio. Yet we are hamstrung by legislation. There's no political enabling environment to carry out these sort of circular economy approaches. The one other thing that I would like to talk about scaling there, and the other thing that I would really like to talk about in terms of research that Prof. Isaacs raised, and this really goes to, we in the research arena, as well as within the sectoral arena, need to start looking at things in a far more disciplinary, transdisciplinary approach, not multidisciplinary in terms of transdisciplinary. Within the realm that I work in, it is really difficult to get an economist or to get a fisheries biologist to think like an economist. People, specialists, particularly academic specialists, will learn more and more about less and less until we know everything about nothing. But to try and get those people to get out of their particular area and to think in a transdisciplinary manner is absolutely critical. To get fisheries biologists to think like economists, and heaven help us to get economists to think like fisheries biologists. Thank you.
Super.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I'm not sure where to begin. But I think to answer the question of, how do we move forward, I'm going to throw or lay the gauntlet for communities and society and say the challenge is on us to hold our political leadership accountable. That begins with how we vote, and once we've voted, what we demand out of them. Prof just spoken to the lack of legislation, or rather that legislation sort of binds our hands in certain areas. And then coincidentally, many years ago, in a previous life, I worked on containerized energy solutions, waste to energy. I worked on small-scale biogas solutions, and rightfully so, legislation was a problem in terms of being able, or just one of the problems in trying to roll out these solutions. But it really, I think, for me, is incumbent upon society to demand a lot more from our leaders. We are to truly, as you said, move from nothing to something. It really is up to communities to demand a lot more. The energy transition is a hot topic, but it's also an opportunity, I think, for society to demand more. And then I always refer to it as energy transition, by the way, not as a just energy transition, because just for me already implies that, rather it says we already assuming it's going to be just. And as the gentleman here said, just means different things to different people. So I personally think we should move away from calling it a just energy transition, because we don't know if it's going to be just or not. Who is it just for? And this is where I'm saying communities need to demand a seat at the table. Communities need to be uncompromising, really, about holding our leadership accountable, and also holding us as academics accountable for the things we say and the research that we embark on, to make sure our research and our opinions that we put out in public is not funded opinions, that they're not tied to, or it is, they preserve scholarly integrity. And I've sadly seen shocking research coming out where it's clearly been funded for specific purposes. And I think it is time that communities, and when I say communities, I mean including the student body and so forth, holds us accountable for the views that we put out in public and where we source our funding and that it needs to stand up, to scrutiny on integrity. I think I'll close.
I want to talk about crisis and crises that we are experiencing. So when we had the COVID health crisis, I thought that that would be an opportunity for us to think differently about how we live on this planet. We are definitely in a climate crisis. And sometimes I worry that, in forums, we don't really talk about the reality of the crisis that we are currently in. We are also in a food crisis. And then in South Africa, the energy crisis is also on top of our list. And I think, when we're talking about political will of government, I think foreign direct investment, it is where the money comes from and who makes the decision. And governments will go to where how much foreign investment is going to be invested in whatever project, whether it's renewable, government would go. So I think that there's a tendency that we are not looking at on the continent where people are fighting back and also taking back land, taking back resources. And I think it is important that we shouldn't disregard that of taking back land and resources, and that does not fit into the legal framework that we all know. So Ken spoke about the informal and subsistence economies. How many of those economies are actually a formal economy that are legal economy? How many of that is related to crime? So I think it is important that we look at the realities. We look at the realities of the crisis, the climate crisis, the energy crisis, and also the food crisis, and to what extent we can deal with those complexities together, not in silos. And I think it is important we approach our research and we approach the issues based on that. And if we are going to wait for government to be able to make, to be able to comply or to for the political will of government to recognize our research that we are doing, it's not gonna happen. I think it is important that we link those crisis narratives to the realities that are out there and find a way forward. Whether it's in your research and your methodology and the financialization and who fund and why we fund, because I must say fossil fuels is a problem. Thank you.
Thanks very much. If we could give our panelists a hand, that'd be great. In closing, many thanks again to EnerGeo for having sponsored the edition of Africa in Fact and this event. We really do appreciate it. We think more conversations, not less, are critical. We do look to continue these conversations in every possible way, both in this kind of forum, but also in our written work and in our field research. I want to thank all of you for your time. I know that it's a busy week and a busy time of year, and can be quite exhausting. So I really do appreciate you taking the time to come and be with us today. Please do take the opportunity to network. That's a major part of the value of coming to something like this. Please do get to know one another, and we look forward to the next round. There will be a write-up of engagement in the Mail and Guardian, and I was speaking with Prof. Lee earlier about the possibility of just putting a policy briefing or policy insights together, just so that we've got something that sticks and doesn't just go into the ether. So again, thank you to our panelists and thank you to all of you for joining us. Okay.
Africa is the continent of the future. The opportunities are endless. From a demographic dividend to abundant natural resources. But to optimize its potential for growth through investments that yield long-term returns, key governance challenges must be tackled. Because these undermine the rule of law and the capabilities of states. Predatory elites gain ascendancy, accountability dissipates, growth stalls, risk rises. Commitment to responsible investment can only be made in economies characterized by good governance. We understand this. It is in our DNA. And our task is to catalyze political accountability across the continent. Through our research and advocacy work, we plant the seeds for accountable leadership to take root. Because where citizens are empowered, the rule of law is established, corruption rooted out, and economic dynamism emerges to propel growth. Investments are honored, businesses grow, the tax base is broadened, people become gainfully employed. At GGA, we are in the business of building virtuous cycles, shifting the governance needle to enable productive and capable states to develop, and cultivating environments in which investors can prosper. Good governance means good business. And if you intend to harvest the opportunities in Africa, we can help to prepare the ground. Invest in us. We look forward to partnering with you. It's the best long-term investment you can make.